Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. Superdrugs. The Nazis apparently dosed their soldiers with a superdrug to enhance their performance. Believe it or not, the remarkable endurance of many soldiers in the war was due to drugs, which would be considered unthinkable to give troops today. This was especially true for the Nazis. In the 1940s, Nazi troops were given an insane amount of meth. Yes, methamphetamine, the very drug that ravages nations all over the world and is usually cooked in secret basement laboratories. The Nazis called it Pervitin, and it was distributed in large doses to all their troops. The idea was that the stimulant would keep the soldiers awake for days at a time. Troops wouldn't need to sleep, and they didn't need nearly as much food. They could perform better under grueling conditions, and they wouldn't be as susceptible to shell shock. They may have been affected by PTSD later in life, but while high on meth, they were basically unstoppable. The ugly truth that nobody likes to admit is that the Americans and the British did something very similar. However, instead of meth, they used an amphetamine called benzedrine. American medical officers would distribute these amphetamines to soldiers for the same purpose as the Nazi medical officers. It was used to keep soldiers awake and keep them fighting. Historians have called this tactic a pharmaceutical arms race. As if it wasn't bad enough, methamphetamines and amphetamines were not the only drugs given to soldiers. Medical officers on both sides would also distribute cocaine where they felt it was necessary. During the war, entire platoons would be awake for days and high on unbelievable amounts of cocaine. You may be wondering, what's the difference between methamphetamine and amphetamine? They're very similar. Methamphetamine belongs to the wider amphetamine family and is generally considered far more harmful to the central nervous system. The only real difference between what the Nazis gave their soldiers and what the Allies gave their troops was a potentially more harmful dosage. Number 9. Nazi zombies. One of the most gruesome myths from World War II is that the Nazis tried to create zombies. It's become an obsession in popular culture, but did this really happen? Surprisingly, the truth is weirder than you may believe. Luckily, the Germans never succeeded in raising the dead, but they did form a research group called the unexplained to study the paranormal. It was established by Heinrich Himmler in July of 1935 and was expanded by Hitler once the war started. Hitler was obsessed with the occult, and many Nazi leaders also had an interest in everything from supernatural treasures to fossilized giants. A little-known fact is that the Nazi Party was initially started as a sort of occult fraternity, which over time morphed into the political party we recognize it as today. The unexplained was responsible for everything from researching physics and astrology to hunting for the Ark of the Covenant. The group even served as grave robbers on 3 separate occasions. They stole the coffin of the 17th century Prussian king Frederick the Great, as well as the Field Marshal von Hindenburg and his wife. These dead warlords were pillaged as part of what was believed to be a secret operation to bring them back to life. The Nazis wouldn't have done it right away, since they didn't have the technology. Still, they were hoping to preserve the bodies and bring the long-dead Prussians back to life as soon as they were able to. Number 8. Bamboo bombers. Deception played a key role in World War II for everyone involved. The Americans used inflatable tanks to fool Hitler and make their army appear bigger than it was. And the Japanese made dummy aircrafts out of bamboo and wood in order to trick the Americans into believing they had larger fleets than they really did. For example, the Japanese created fake 4-engine bombers out of wood, with their propellers and wheels held together by bamboo struts. Near the end of the war in 1945, U.S. military photographers in Japanese territory captured amazing images of dummy vehicles. The Japanese built dummy tanks carved into volcanic rock in Iwo Jima to trick American soldiers, sometimes creating entire tank platoons out of stone. They painted a full decoy B-29 bomber with a wingspan of over 300 feet, making it look like it was flying above an airfield. They even painted fake flames shooting from its inboard engine. The idea here was to trick American planes into bringing themselves down to investigate, falling straight into a trap where they would be shot down by heavy artillery. The Japanese went so far as to build scarecrows in fake dugouts. They armed the fake troops with bamboo weapons to make them look like real soldiers. This was supposed to distract the Allies from the real infantry. Every decoy that attracted attention was a win for the Japanese. It wasn't exactly a secret program, but it was certainly an effective strategy and utilized by all sides in the war. Number 7. Fox Warfare. Operation Fantasia was a bizarre strategy used by the United States during World War II. It was extremely out of the box, an operation meant to demoralize Japanese fighters by mimicking legendary spirits. This was one of the more bizarre psychological warfare ideas that was created near the beginning of the war. Scientists were already working on things like explosive pancake batter, bats strapped with bombs, and a spray that mimics the terrible smell of feces. Apparently, the Americans wanted to attack the Japanese with poop spray. Operation Fantasia came from strategist Ed Salinger, a warfare strategist for the Office of Strategic Services. Ed had been in Tokyo before the war began, running his own import-export business. Because of this, he had a good understanding of Japanese culture. He could speak Japanese and knew a lot about their superstitions. In 1943, he suggested destroying Japanese morale by exposing the soldiers to the kitsune, a fox spirit with magical abilities. In Japanese folklore, the kitsune is a sign of doom. There were all kinds of weird ideas to expose Japanese civilians and soldiers to the fox. The army tried flying fox-shaped balloons over Japanese villages. They had a whistle company create an instrument that mimicked the sound a fox made. The idea was to give fox whistles to their soldiers so they could blow them when they got into battle with Japanese regiments. The military even had a company create artificial fox odors. They truly believed that somehow ordinary Japanese citizens would recognize the smell of a fox and cower in fear. Unfortunately for the US, the project was a massive failure. The Japanese forces didn't know what a fox sounded like, and they certainly weren't afraid of fox balloons. The American military overestimated the Japanese fear of spirits. The greatest military minds in America really thought the Japanese would fear the image of a fox, just like children who are scared of the dark. Number 6. The Philadelphia Experiment. There is an urban legend which says that on October 28, 1943, the USS Eldridge conducted a top-secret experiment. The government had supposedly tried to create a technology that would make all their ships invisible on enemy radar, and so they tested it out in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. It's unclear exactly what happened that day, as the experiment has never been confirmed by the military. However, witnesses claim they saw an eerie greenish glow surrounding the hull of the USS Eldridge, and then, suddenly, the ship disappeared from view. The vessel was seen for a brief moment later that day in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, and then it somehow reappeared back in Philadelphia. Several members of the crew allegedly went insane after the experiment. Some of them are said to have developed a mysterious illness, while others were rumored to have been physically fused to the ship. Apparently, the U.S. military tested out some type of teleportation or invisibility technology, but it went horribly wrong. To this day, nobody can say for sure what happened at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943. Number 5. Operation Aika. In 1943, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini failed to recreate the Roman Empire, as he had always dreamed of doing. His campaign in North Africa ended in defeat, and without enough soldiers to defend his country, the Soviet Union was on their doorstep. To make matters even worse for Mussolini, the Allies invaded Sicily. At this point, Italy had all but lost the war. Then, on July 19, 1943, Allied bombers decimated parts of Rome. They damaged airports and smashed apart the Basilica of St. Lawrence. Members of the Italian government started to turn against Mussolini, and the Grand Council voted no confidence in their dictator on the 24th of July. The next day, Mussolini was arrested and imprisoned by orders of the Italian king, Victor Emmanuel III. This was the start of Operation Aika. Hitler, afraid of what might happen to him after his ally was arrested, hatched a plot to break Mussolini out of jail. Surprisingly, it worked. In something out of a Mission Impossible movie, an elite team of Germans rescued Mussolini from imprisonment and brought him back to Hitler. In the end, it didn't really matter. Mussolini was instated as the puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic, but the war was already coming to an end. Mussolini tried to escape with his mistress, but they were captured on April 27, 1945. The next morning, the man who had tried to reform the Roman Empire was killed by firing squad. Number 4. Mustard gas testing. During World War II, the American military carried out chemical experiments on young soldiers. One of these unfortunate soldiers was a man named Rollins Edwards. According to Edwards himself during an interview when he was 93 years old, it was a horrific experience. Edwards said he was led into a wooden gas chamber with a group of other soldiers. The door was locked behind them, and then dangerous chemicals were piped into the room. It was a mixture of mustard gas and lewisite, and those being experimented on felt like they were on fire. The men in the room started screaming and began trying to kick the door down to escape. Some of them even passed out. There were 60,000 enlisted men enrolled in the secret government program, which was not declassified until 1993. The whole point behind the experiment was to see what mustard gas and other chemical agents could do to troops. Those soldiers brought into the program were almost entirely African American. According to Edwards, the government wanted to see the effect of mustard gas on black skin. Unfortunately, the experiments didn't end there. Military officials also used Japanese Americans and Puerto Rican soldiers as test subjects. The American military experimented with dangerous gas on just about anyone who wasn't white-skinned. These soldiers were sworn to secrecy under the threat of a dishonorable discharge, as well as prison time. They also didn't give their subjects adequate health care in the following months or years. Instead, the military let them suffer from the long-term effects of one of the most horrendous gases ever created. Number 3. Operation Grife. Operation Grife was a Trojan horse situation that took place during World War II. Hitler came up with a special group of secret German military soldiers who were tasked with disguising themselves as Allied soldiers in order to sneak behind enemy lines. The main objective of these secret soldiers was to wreak as much havoc as possible. This operation was carried out near the end of the war after D-Day. The Americans and the British had a solid foothold in Europe, but they still had the full might of Germany to face. Their supply lines were stretched extremely thin. The farther they pushed inland from the shores of France, the more desperate the situation became. German soldiers who could speak English were given uniforms stolen from prisoners of war. They were then sent behind enemy lines to do things like cut telephone wires and sabotage radio stations. The ultimate goal was to get close enough to President Eisenhower to kidnap him. However, their plan was a massive failure. The Americans soon found out about the mission and became obsessive with security. Soldiers started asking security questions that only Americans would know the answer to, such as what is Sinatra's first name? This became a major issue because they failed to keep their allies in Britain in mind. British soldiers hardly knew anything about American pop culture and couldn't answer their questions to pass security checks. In the end, Operation Grife did cause a lot of confusion, but it didn't win Hitler the war. Number 2. American propaganda. The propaganda machine used by America to create support for the war was a truly effective beast. The American government used the media to inspire patriotism while instigating hatred for the Axis forces. This campaign of propaganda between 1941 and 1945 helped with war production, increased public acceptance of the war, and ignited a fire in the belly of the soldiers who would go on to fight against the enemy. Large-scale campaigns were initiated by the government to sell war bonds. They also used propaganda in order to promote factory efficiency. During this time, civilian morale was basically held together by patriotic propaganda. Americans distributed pamphlets showing leaders like Hitler and Mussolini as caricatures, and they used extremely racist images to dehumanize the Japanese. In 1942, President Roosevelt created the Office of War Information. This agency was behind manipulating public perception and essentially tried to brainwash the entire population. The organization used multiple tools in order to communicate with the American public. Things such as Hollywood movies, radio stations, and printing presses were manipulated to push their message until 1948. Number 1. Hitler's Army. In August of 1934, Adolf Hitler proclaimed himself the leader of the German Reich. At that time, all the military leaders in Germany swore a new oath to the Führer, swearing their service to Hitler himself. Then, in 1935, Hitler began building his mega army that would take on the world. He did this by violating the Treaty of Versailles, which was put into place in 1919. The treaty set terms for Germany and stated they were no longer allowed to have a standing army. It specifically called for German demilitarization. But Hitler didn't care about the Treaty of Versailles, and on March 16, 1935, he reintroduced the draft. Almost overnight, Hitler suddenly had an army of 550,000 men ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. This number was huge compared to the 100,000 soldiers he had before. Then, between 1933 and 1939, Hitler used the draft to mobilize over 3 million troops. He also introduced thousands of new, technologically advanced planes and tanks. In just a few dozen years, Germany went from a few dozen combat vehicles to a massive fleet. Thanks for watching! What do you think was the most shocking experiment or secret project from World War II? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!